We, the Muslim community, object and condemn the use of all and any religious offensive material.
The backlash began when Macron refused to renounce caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad for showing them in a class on freedom of expression.
In order to understand why the Prophet was sent to Mecca, we must first understand the climate of Arabia prior to his birth. Why were the people of Arabia in need of a messenger?
So Arabia, around the year 570, which is Prophet Muhammad's birth, was a society steeped in tribal divisions. So this essentially means that an individual, a human being's sense of belonging and worth in society was actually predicated on the family and the tribe that they were born into. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on ancestry and bloodlines. So there wasn't really a lot of social mobility. If you want to think of it in a different way, it's almost like the caste system that we see in India. So the social dynamics were heavily predicated on ancestry, and there was a lot of division.
So it's a society where there is not really much place for individualism. I mean, you can't really survive on your own in such an environment, and therefore you need a larger social unit, in that case a tribe, to support you. And there was a sort of recognition, yes, you are part of this tribe, and you know the tribe will protect you, or your tribe will protect you, will take care and protect your dependents if you're not there anymore. And in return, you owe your tribe loyalty. So you support your tribe in its commercial activities, and also you support your tribe in warfare. So Arab society, because of its tribal nature, was characterized by constant warfare. So there were feuds and struggles between different tribes, sometimes dragging on for years and decades. So tribalism also created, if you like, an almost constant state of warfare in the society.
And Arabia also in the 6th and 7th century was squeezed in between two empires. The Byzantine Empire to the north and northwest. The Byzantine Empire, of course, is the kind of extension of the Roman Empire, and this was a Christian civilization. And then to the east, we have the Persian Empire, which was largely Zoroastrian. And these two empires were colliding with each other and fighting for land and supremacy and resources. And the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula were kind of used as a pawn in this big chess game. And they were largely oppressed by these various forces around them. And then, of course, to the southwest, we had another actually powerful civilization, the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, or the Christian kingdom of Aksum. The terms Abyssinia and Aksum are used interchangeably. And this was also a significant civilization that later came to play a significant role in the experiences of the early Muslim community.
The second crucial feature of Arab society is that the majority of Arabs at that time were polytheists, which means they worshipped a number of different deities, Arab deities that had Arab names, and they were depicted in idols, in statues and images, and they were the main object of worship. In addition to the practices of polytheism among most Arab tribes, there was also a very important Jewish presence, a significant Jewish community on the Arab Peninsula that assimilated very much into Arab society. So they spoke Arabic, they also integrated into the tribal system, so Jews were members of Arab tribes or constituted their own tribes. And there was also a very important Christian community, in particular in the southern parts of the Arab Peninsula. And that has certain consequences. It means that sort of the average Arab, regardless of which deities and gods they would worship, would be familiar with Judaism, with Christianity, with the biblical stories. And that also explains how the Quran, for example, addressing this environment, refers to biblical figures. I mean, when we look at the Quran, how it talks about Abraham, Noah, Moses, Jesus, we don't get much of an introduction who these figures are, which suggests that the Arabs who were addressed by the Quran initially at that time knew already who Abraham was, who Moses was, who Jesus was, because they were already quite familiar with the biblical stories and with the basic beliefs and practices of Jews and Christians at that time.
There are many misconceptions that the Prophet Muhammad announced his prophethood and brought the religion of Islam straight away. However, in fact, the Prophet revealed to the public of his prophethood at the age of 40 and then educated the Arabs about Islam. Prior to this, he was an orphan child who grew up into a simple and honest merchant.
The Prophet's childhood is something I've reflected on many times. I used to be a lecturer taking people on travels through Islamic countries, and I wanted them to try and imagine Muhammad not as a great prophet of God, not a great revered figure, but this lone orphan who never met his father. His father died before he was born, living with his mother, going off to meet his maternal cousins, his mother possibly already aware that she wasn't going to last forever, taking him to see his cousins, dying and then coming back, and he passed into the household of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. 2 years of contentment there, under the household of the clan chieftain. And then his grandfather dies, and then he's passed to his uncle Abu Talib. So he was a thrice orphaned young boy, age 8. And when he passed into the household of Abu Talib, who he adored all his life, it was very much a working childhood. He had to earn his keep on the caravan trails across Arabia. And Mecca was incredibly well placed, halfway to the Yemen and to the incense, the spice gardens that the whole world wanted, and halfway towards Syria, Damascus and Gaza. And these, immense long 40-day roads would have been his university.
Both the later Muslim sources of the Abbasid era in the late 700s and into the 800s and 900s, both of those sources and some more nearly contemporary Christian sources of the 600s admit that the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant, and that he traveled more than once up to the Eastern Roman Empire for trade, that he went up to Palestine, he went up to, it is said, Bostra and Damascus.
He was known through the Arabic term al-Amin, which is the trustworthy one. And he got this reputation largely through not only his everyday conduct and his ability to kind of operate ethically and morally, but he also got it through his leadership skills that he demonstrated as a merchant. He was an individual from the early years of his life, really when he was a teenager. He was in charge of bringing various camel trading caravans, which had a lot of goods from Mecca, like frankincense and ivory and so on and so forth. And Muhammad was responsible for guiding these trading caravans throughout the Arabian Peninsula and then even further north up into the Levant. So he was known as a person that you could trust, a person that instilled a sense of confidence.
He was, well regarded, despite, if you like, of his humble background and his, if you like, rather difficult family circumstances, as somebody who is sincere, who is trustworthy, who is reliable, who is diligent, and earned in that way the respect of his contemporaries.
One of the most intriguing stories for a Westerner to reflect upon is the tale of the Prophet going in his uncle's caravan and stopping at Bahira, who's a Christian hermit, somewhere outside the bustling Syrian city of Bostra. And I went there on a trip to see if I could find any little sort of emotional footprints or traditions about Bahira. And this story has the caravan being greeted by this Christian hermit scholar and feasting everybody, and the hermit wandering around looking for something that wasn't there. And he eventually asked Abu Talib, who is missing? He said, "Oh, my young orphan nephew, he's guarding the camels. He's fine, that's his job." And the hermit insists on Muhammad being included into the dinner he'd offered for the caravan traders. And they're recognizing something in his eyes, or something, we don't know what, that prophesied he had an enormous future for mankind. And taking the uncle aside and asking him to watch over. So this is one of the treasures of the world waiting to happen. And I love it because it's got that sort of sophisticated element that reminds you of the Christianity present in ancient Arabia and the sort of respect out of which sort of Islam still accords these Christian mystics in the desert.
We know 15 years prior to the beginning of the revelations, he married Khadija. Khadija was one of the wealthiest merchants in all of Mecca, regardless of being a woman, of all people. And before Khadija and Muhammad married, Khadija basically hired Muhammad as the primary merchant responsible for her goods.
Found out this fantastic report that he was as good, if not better, than what she'd heard. And she, in a way, proposes herself to Muhammad because she's richer than him, and he's a poor young man on the caravan trade. And they have the most extraordinarily successful marriage, and Khadija gives Muhammad the only children that he'll ever have, and was his soul mate, his equal. And they were both very, very interested in the early monotheistic group of sort of mystics around Mecca, looking towards some sign of God in a rather godless society.
It is also quite clear that he looked for, if you like, an alternative for the social order that existed among the Arabs at that time, an alternative to the tribal system. I mean, he was involved in creating a kind of temporary alliance, cooperation between different tribes. So there, we get a sense that he sort of fundamentally disagreed with the social order, the tribalism in which he grew up, and sort of tried out different ways of how these relationships can be redefined. In terms of his sort of religious inclinations, again, we don't know that much about it for certain, but it seems again that he really detested and rejected the polytheism and the idol worship of his contemporaries, and again sought alternative ways of religiosity. I mean, we know from the tradition that as an adult, at least on a yearly basis, he would go on a kind of spiritual retreat, going to a cave on the outskirts of Mecca, spending there some time to meditate and so on. So again, he was somebody who, in a sense, was at a certain distance with the social practices, the social order, and the religious beliefs of his contemporaries.
In the year 610 AD, the angel Gabriel came down to Prophet Muhammad while he was in a cave in the Mount Hira in Mecca, and revealed to him the first sentences of the Quran, and informed him it was time to bring Islam to the people. The mission of his prophethood began: to deliver a message from his God to the people, to teach them about equality, shed light on their racism, and to reform the society into one with morals, ethics, and values.
he brought a new vision of what a society is supposed to be. Now, this was not to be an ummah that was defined by tribal boundaries, by racial boundaries, national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, but by religious belief and conviction. And in that, he's not new. I mean, in the sense that Abraham before him and the Jewish prophets also saw, the Jewish prophets maybe a little less because they also saw kind of a tribal heritage also. So he's introducing an entirely new idea of what it is to be a people that is united by conviction, not just by blood or by language or by ethnicity.
When we talk about racism nowadays, we think primarily about skin color, the kind of transatlantic slave trade until the 19th century, and of course slavery in America. And that's how we sort of approach issues of racism. So again, very much something to do with skin color, discrimination, and a very difficult and a very problematic legacy of the enslavement of Africans in America. Now, that type of racism did not exist in Arabia in the 7th century. Because it was a different society, it was a different historical context. There were other types of racism, and one particular form of racism that I mentioned earlier on is, if you like, what we might call tribal racism, tribalism, the hostility that existed between different tribes, and seeking a clear separation and boundaries between different tribes. Another form of racism was what we might call a certain type of Arab racism, so the sense that the Arabs are a noble race and nobler than other races. And of course, we know from the history that, of course, this type of Arab racism, or this sort of sense of Arab superiority, was not eradicated by Islam, overnight. And the other, which again, I'm not sure whether we can call it racism, the other element of social difference and disparity was based again on your social status. So it was based again on your lineage. Did you come from, again, a family or lineage that was considered to be particularly noble, and that has an impact on the social and political status in your society? Were you wealthy? And of course, were you a slave? And of course, at the lower end of society were the slaves that were mistreated.
What's so extraordinary about early Islam is its decision to break away from all these existing labels of clan, faith, family, and to include slaves, the undercastes from wherever they were. We know that the first muezzin, the person who had the public honour of calling the Muslims to prayer, was a black slave. So we have this society that look through all invisible at the labels that obsess us.
The Quran is quite remarkable in this regard, it seems to me, because it has verses praising what we would think of as ethnic diversity. It says God has made people male and female and members of various peoples and tribes so that they may come to know one another. And so diversity in the Quran is seen as a learning opportunity. That diversity clearly creates sets of experiences and knowledge that aren't universal. And so then when you meet someone who's different from you, there's an opportunity then to enlarge yourself, to learn from them. And for a 7th century document to say that men have something to learn from women, because it's the clear implication of the verse, is quite remarkable. And then elsewhere in the Quran, it talks about the tongues and hues, the languages and complexions of being diverse, and that this is a sign of God. And again, there's a kind of comparison to nature. How a beautiful bowl of varied fruit, pomegranates and dates and oranges and so forth, it strikes the eye as beautiful. The Quran makes an analogy between that and the ethnic diversity of its world.
Although he came with the message of peace and the desire to revolutionize the society he was sent to, Many around him opposed his message and wanted to kill him and those that followed in his message.
So around the year 615, the early Muslim community was facing severe persecution. People were being martyred, tortured, oppressed in unimaginable ways. And Muhammad encouraged a group of his people to seek refuge in the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia across the Red Sea in northeast Africa. And Muhammad did so because he had knowledge that the Christian king, Ashama ibn Abjar, was a Christian king who was not only wise and knowledgeable and just, but he was a Christian king that embodied the true spirit of Jesus, which was compassion, love, mercy, and peace. So the group of the early Muslims actually, if you can picture it, they gave up everything. They left their surroundings in Mecca, their comfort, their family, their friends. They crossed the Red Sea on a ship, knowing, who knows if they were going to come back. They certainly didn't know if they would return to Mecca. But they end up being welcomed by the king of Abyssinia, Ibn Abjar. But even more than that, not only did the king provide them safety, but he actually defended them in front of the enemies of the Muslims, the Quraysh, who actually followed the Muslims to Abyssinia to petition the king to send the Muslims back, which would have inevitably led to the Muslims' demise. So the historical sources tell us that King Ibn Abjar, after listening to the various parties, King Ibn Abjar literally said to the Quraysh, the enemies of the Muslims, "Not for a mountain of gold would I give these people back to you. Not for a mountain of gold." So nothing could sway his position on defending the Muslims. And we also have a beautiful theological exchange in which King Ibn Abjar is asking this monotheistic community, the Muslims, "Who are you? I've never heard of this faith of Islam. I've never heard what a Muslim is." So the king asks them, "Explain your faith." And Jafar, one of the early Muslims, along with his companions, shared Surah Miriam, which is the chapter of Mary in the Quran. And the Quran holds Mary up in high esteem, calls her essentially one of the most important women to have ever walked the earth. And we also know that during this exchange with King Ibn Abjar, the Muslims explained their views on Jesus, referring to Jesus as, the Spirit of God, the Word of God, the Messiah, which are all really positions that Christians also hold of Jesus. So not only do we have the king defending the Muslims, but we also have this beautiful dialogue in which Christians and Muslims are able to see eye to eye on really important issues to both communities, Jesus and Mary.
The way, if you like, a report, again, there were pre-existing links and connections with Abyssinia that predate Islam, but the way that these Muslims then, if you like, in exile, forged with the Abyssinian king was again very much emphasizing the commonality in the fundamental beliefs of Muslims and Christians. The veneration of Muslims, or that Muslims show towards Jesus, and the immense regard and respect they hold him. So again, based on, if you like, this shared biblical heritage, Muslims in Abyssinia, were able to find a place and protection within this particular kingdom.
In order to truly transform the society that ran based on tribes and class systems, he introduced laws and rules by which the people would follow, as well as ethics and values that encouraged equality and respect for all races and religions.
I think Christians or Westerners think of Islam as a sort of separate religion. And I think it's often baffling for them to realize that even in the Quran, there's an absolute verse respecting the Torah and the Gospels as the truth that confirms the message that's coming down to Muhammad. And this is in the Quran. This is not a hadith, not a saying, not a historical passage. And so you have Islam as almost like a sort of organic coexistence from these earlier faith groups. And I think that's quite dazzling for people to look at. Of course, famously, there are more references to the Virgin Mary in the Quran than in the Gospels. And there's this very delicate interlacing of the traditions and an understanding that although Muhammad was passionate in conveying his own message, he tolerated, respected, understood and protected all the existing spiritual traditions, Sabaean, Jewish and Christian. And it was not just one Christianity, there were about 12 different Christian traditions in ancient Arabia. So you've got this sort of, not a sort of single thread. Sometimes we're too obsessed by, we've got an Archbishop of Canterbury that gives us the rules for the Church of England, but ancient Arabia wasn't like that. It was a dense sort of tapestry of belief systems.
Now we know that in the time in Mecca, Muhammad, engaged with Jews and Christians in debates, in dialogue to sort of present, the purpose of his own mission and the relationship with, the biblical prophets and with previous religions. And I think what is also very important to recognize, and this is affirmed, throughout the Quran, that Muhammad, received the message that very much was a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. I mean, one could almost say that maybe a bit simplistically that Islam was not meant in a sense to be a new religion, but it's the restoration of the original teachings that had been given to Abraham, to Moses, to Jesus, to previous prophets, and that the main purpose of Muhammad's mission was to restore this original message that had been given to Jews and Christians before.
From 610 to 622, he was preaching in the small sanctuary town of Mecca, which had a shrine to God, and appears to have been in a largely pagan environment. His contemporaries were worshiping the old Arabian gods and goddesses. Alat is mentioned, and Al-Azza and Manat. And there may have been some Christians in Mecca. There's some verses at least that seem to suggest that. And so in this first period of the prophet's preaching, of course, he had a small number of devoted followers. And at some point, his preaching became public. And so there appears to have been a strong reaction against his preaching because he preached monotheism, he preached the one God, and the illegitimacy of polytheism. There seems to have been a strong reaction to that from the Meccan pagans. And the Quran talks about the prophet and his followers being taunted and harassed. The Quran instructs the prophet and his followers to treat these stubborn non-believers with love. So at one point it says, it implies that if you're sitting with these pagans and they start going off on you, they start attacking you, withdraw from them graciously. The word is jamilan, or beautifully. Sure, you can't sit with somebody who's attacking you like that, but you should withdraw graciously or beautifully. And then it goes on to say that you should wish them peace. The phrase "Assalamu alaikum" or "peace be upon you" is actually a prayer. It's a prayer that God will grant you peace and security. And the word peace in Arabic doesn't mean just the absence of conflict, but refers to well-being and prosperity. And so the Quran instructs the Prophet and his followers to wish peace on those who are taunting and harassing them. And then it goes beyond that as the Meccan period unfolds. And it instructs them to return evil with good. And this is a very remarkable passage because it actually seems to me to go beyond anything in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. That the believers are to reply with good to those who do evil to them. And there is a pledge that if they do so, they may well turn this enemy into a devoted patron, someone who would actually support them.
The early Muslim community was facing extreme persecution in Mecca. And Muhammad and the believers actually moved northward from Mecca to Medina to essentially create a new system of living, a new kind of governance. And Muhammad was the leader of this movement. He was actually called on by the people of Yathrib. Yathrib was the name of Medina before Muhammad changed it. Muhammad was called on to mediate a generations-long tribal feud, because the people of Medina at this time, they were pagan and there were Jewish populations as well, all these tribes. And these tribes could not figure out how to get along. And Muhammad brought these people together and said, listen, we can't continue with the way things have been operating. We can't continue with these tribal divisions. So Muhammad brings them together and he creates, of course, with their approval, one of the first known written constitutions in the history of humankind, which is the Constitution of Medina in the year 622. And if you read the language of the Constitution of Medina, it's actually not too dissimilar from the Constitution of the United States of America. So all of the tribes that agreed to this document were given freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the right to own property. And I think more importantly, the Constitution of Medina made it clear that if one of the tribes was attacked by an external force, it was effectively an attack on everyone. So this vision for the early Muslim community that Muhammad kind of printed onto history at this time was truly remarkable, absolutely revolutionary for the time period in which it actually unfolded. But even today, when we think about a nation, a civic nation, in which all of the communities within the nation are given these human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. I mean, this is beautiful. These are the things that we should cherish because they're human rights.
His role is not as some all-powerful prophet deciding every possible law. Very modestly, Muhammad goes to Medina as an arbitrator, as the chief judge. His single great authority is just that when there is a dispute that threatens the oasis, they will come to him for his opinion. They'll also protect him, as they did, with their lives. And the only time he gets cross with the community was anybody does anything treasonable, because they'd all vowed to share this vital decision of peace has to be held by all. Just as we go to war together, we have peace together. And directly from this midnight, very romantic midnight oath in Aqaba, which is a mountain pass about 5 kilometers outside of Mecca, the site of it is still traditionally remembered. From that, the Constitution of Medina would be a signed document based on that oath, which include 2 women amongst the 75 representatives of the Oasis of Medina.
What is quite important, what is crucial about this document is, again, it introduces a very different understanding of how society should be organized. I mean, it recognizes that there are different tribes, but it emphasizes whenever there is conflict these conflicts should be resolved peacefully, and it introduced a new sense of social cohesion, of social unity, with the concept of the Ummah, the community. So yes, these Arabs in Medina, they were part of different tribes, but what united them was they were now part of a single Ummah, of a single community, and their loyalty is now not primarily to their tribe anymore, but to this new community. What is equally important to recognize, I mean, there was a very, very significant Jewish presence in Medina, and there were a couple of Jewish tribes, and other Jews were, if you like, members of other tribes. And the document is very explicit that the Jews are part of this Ummah. They are mentioned as members of this Ummah in the Constitution of Medina, because at that time, to be a member of the Ummah, you had to fulfill two criteria. First, you had to be part of the Millat Ibrahim. You had to be part of the nation of Abraham. You had to be of Abrahamic descent. And of course, that's what the Jews were. The second criteria was La ilaha illallah. There's no God but God. And again, the Jews fulfilled this criteria as well. So by fulfilling these two fundamental criteria of being member of the Ummah at this time, the Jews were very much part of this early Ummah that Muhammad created and are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution of Medina.
So very simply, to the Jews their religion and to the Muslims their religion. I mean, that one line established an interreligious Muslim society, a multi-religious Muslim society. And that's an incredible model. I mean, the idea that people of different religions can actually live together in the same society and give each other room and rights to practice their religion is already really an amazing innovation, and something that we can learn from. I think we still are struggling with that idea. We're still struggling with what it means to create a society that is multi-religious or multi-ethnic, multi-language, multi-racial. And yet already, in the Charter of Medina, the Prophet is already envisioning that happening.
Prior to the birth of Prophet Muhammad, women in Arabia held no value or status and were deemed as objects or property rather than individuals of their own. History tells us that Arab men would bury alive their newborn baby girls, as they were considered useless and of no worth. The Prophet Muhammad immediately forbade this and educated those around him on the value and worth of women and ensured they were given the due respect they deserved.
So, in addition to creating a civic nation, in addition to fighting racial equality, Prophet Muhammad should be recognized today as largely a revolutionary for women's rights. Arabia in the 6th century, in the early 7th century, was also a society that did not look fondly upon women. Women were largely seen as property. Young girls, young women were largely valued as almost commodities to wed off to another tribe, to create bonds, secure bonds between families. And Muhammad comes and he really changes up the rules of the game. He comes and he says, women, if they're not happy in a marriage, they have the right to leave that marriage. They have the right to divorce.
The mission of Muhammad and the mission of Islam brought in a radical change of perspective by bestowing actually on women humanity, by seeing in them fellow human beings, and also, quite importantly, fellow human beings that in terms of their spiritual relationship with God are on a completely equal footing with man.
The pre-Muslim pagans attempted to control their population because they lived in an arid region where you could run out of food or water very easily if your population grew too large. But their method of birth control was horrible because it was to sometimes kill baby girls. And that was actually not peculiar to them. This was a birth control method that has been documented in ancient Athens and in ancient Egypt and so forth. But the Prophet, the Quran strictly forbids it, and obviously the percentage of women in a population is what determines their fertility rate. But the Quran elevated women so that people were not to dispose of their girls in this way.
In the wider context of the Middle East, and if we sort of compare, if you like, the status that Islam brought to women at that time, if we compare that with Christianity and Judaism at this time, let's say we talk, for example, about divorce. In Jewish law, only a man, a husband, can initiate a divorce. A wife cannot initiate a divorce. Islam was the first religion who brought this to women. In Christianity at that time, divorce was completely outlawed. It was haram. You couldn't get a divorce as a Christian. And again, Islam not only gave men the permission to initiate divorce, but gave the same right to women as well. And equally revolutionary in that time, it gave women the right to own property, to inherit, and so on, rights that women did not enjoy in other communities and religions at that time. So, certainly in the context of 7th century Arabia, the changes that Muhammad brought and that Islam brought to that society were revolutionary.
With the aim of revolutionizing society at large during the time he was alive, as well as for the generations beyond him, the state of the world in which we now live in goes against the basic principles Prophet Muhammad came to teach. Political abuse, racial inequality, global hunger, slavery, war and terror is evident all around the world today. And further to this, we have become accustomed to it, and is considered our new norm.
If Prophet Muhammad was with us today, I think he would be very disheartened. I think he would be shocked at the level of tribalism that we see in our communities. And I think he would also be shocked at the lack of appreciation for human life and the dignity of human life. And, as a Catholic, as someone that is inspired by Pope Francis and Muhammad, I think, would agree on the need for human beings to end the culture of indifference. And this indifference essentially points to an individual's lack of care for the plight of others. And we see this playing out in the massive refugee crisis that is still ongoing around the world. And a lot of people, they see these images of young children, women, with a bag of all their belongings, and they've left their home on a boat, not knowing if they're going to get across the sea, not knowing if they're going to be safe upon putting their feet on the ground on land, not knowing any of these things. And, Muhammad would be someone who is saying, hey, this person has given up everything. They've fled violence. They've fled persecution. It's our obligation, not merely as people of faith, but as human beings, to make life easier for people, to end this culture of indifference and to embrace a culture of compassion for our fellow human beings who are dealing with these terrible obstacles in life.
I think that when we look at the world today, as I said before, he tried to envision a new kind of community based on conviction and based on values. And what we see in the world today is, of course, that that's not what most societies are based on. Most societies are based on greed and opportunity and national identity and things which are really fleeting and while some people have, there are a lot of people who have not. And Islam also emphasized the care of widows and orphans, the people who are most vulnerable in society. I imagine that the Prophet looked at the world today and saw how many have-nots there are in society and what we do with those people who are most vulnerable in our societies. I think he would cry. And hopefully he would cry out and encourage people to be taking care of the poor, to be taking care of the widows and the orphans and those people who are vulnerable. As far as our racial hatreds are concerned, and our ethnic hatreds and our religious hatreds, we see that was not his way. That's not the society that he envisioned. And so I imagine he might be very disappointed.
And I'm fairly certain that we wouldn't hear about him, we wouldn't see him on television, we wouldn't see him in UN conferences, we wouldn't see television meetings with great flags in the background of him being filmed. He'd be searching out the most disadvantaged community in the world, which was his fate in his own lifetime, to live amongst the very poor, illiterate Arabs on the edge of three powerful empires. And he was very content to help that one community try and make their peace with God, to turn what was a very anarchic, violent, aggressive society into one that was spiritual and ethical and protective of each other.
Whilst everyone is entitled to their own views, it is important that we maintain the utmost level of respect for other religions and their revered figures, including Islam. Depicting the Prophet in a manner such as the ones used by various cartoon publishers only incites hatred and disrespect, and should not be the way in which modern liberal values are acted upon.
There has been, for the last 15 years, a debate about the relationship between freedom of speech and ridiculing Islam, ridiculing Islamic beliefs, or even critically engaging with Islam. And I think the first thing we need to recognize, and that is recognized by everyone who defends freedom of speech, that freedom of speech is not an absolute right, that it always operates within certain limitations. I mean, the most basic and prominent example is that if you're sitting in a cinema, you just can't shout out fire if there's no fire. I mean, that is not protected by freedom of speech because you're endangering other people. But, apart from this, very, mundane example, everybody who defends freedom of speech nowadays would say that, of course, making racist comments, anti-Semitic comments, sexist comments, homophobic comments is not protected by freedom of speech. The freedom of speech hits its boundary there. And I think the challenge is that this awareness that we've got vulnerable minorities and we can't just ridicule them as we like, and we can't just make fun of their beliefs and practices as we like. I mean, this has been recognized again in terms of racial minorities, homosexuals, Jews, and so on. But I think European society or Western societies more generally haven't quite reached this understanding that, of course, the same standards need to apply to Muslim minorities as well.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Ultimately, it cannot be denied that from an academic perspective, history speaks to the high character of Prophet Muhammad and records him as a kind and humble individual. Yet unfortunately, misconceptions regarding the personality of Prophet Muhammad, along with disrespectful caricatures, continue to circulate, with no efforts put in place to rectify nor condemn this behavior.
Islam teaches people to greet each other with peace, and that's not a small thing. You know, when we greet each other with peace, it's saying that we want it. The word peace comes from a word for wholeness. Word for wholeness. What we're saying is we want wholeness for other people, and that's not a small thing. That is a huge, huge commitment, and everybody has to commit themselves to that. We have to not just say the words. It's not enough to wish people peace. It's important to really wish people peace.
From an impartial perspective, we can learn that the Prophet Muhammad should be admired for the revolutionary work he introduced into his community in order to achieve equality and respect for all individuals.
The other thing that's really important for Westerners to understand about early Islam is that the Prophet was coming in, he was bringing an ethical society, he's bringing good teaching about how to look after people, how to look after widows, orphans, how to respect women, how to be a father who was responsible for your children. All the ethical fruits of Islamic society he was bringing, but he wasn't claiming to be a political chieftain. He wasn't like a conquering Alexander the Great. All the clan chieftains kept their position in society. So it's very important that Islam can go into a society. It doesn't have to conquer, it doesn't have to be the political boss, it doesn't have to be the president, it doesn't have to be the viceroy. All that was good that Muhammad was offering the world came with him and the Quran and his ethical message. And it shows how, which is often forgotten, the great vast frontiers of modern Islam, like in West Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of that happened by peaceful progress of Islamic society. We're slightly obsessed by Arab conquests in the Western imagination. And it's very interesting to reflect that most of the progression of the Islamic world and the wider world happened with this very slow osmosis of people bringing an ethical sort of body together.
For 40 years before bringing the religion of Islam, the Prophet primarily aimed to reform the society he was in, to remove racial prejudices, amend gender equality, and to essentially ensure mankind treated one another with care and consideration.
There are two questions. What is the role of faith, and what should be the role of faith? So the role of faith as it is at the moment is very often to polarize us. We use faith as a way of pulling ourselves apart. We use it as an instrument of social cohesion, of getting up people's anger and indignation. And I don't think that's what faith is supposed to be. I think that faith is supposed to be something that glues us to our values. And when we're glued to those values, we're able to see those values in other people. I know in my faith that I have many of the same values as my fellow Muslims, as my fellow Christians, and as a person of faith, I'm able to see that together. So I think that faith has to stop being the problem, has to be part of the solution.